Hello, welcome to Free Bible Commentary with Pastor Teacher Dr. Bob Utley. Be sure to visit Free Bible Commentary at www.freebiblecommentary.org. Now, here's Bob.
We're continuing our study today in Isaiah, and we're dealing with another literary unit, chapters 36 through 39. It's kind of a historical transition from the emphasis on Assyria, that's been Isaiah 1 through 39, through Babylon, which is 40 and following. This is a historical setting. It's in prose and not in poetry, very uncharacteristic of Isaiah, and it makes the transition from these two world powers. I believe in predictive prophecy, so personally I don't have a problem that Isaiah knew about Babylon, because in Isaiah 44 and 45 he's going to name Cyrus, which is the Persian leader, even farther removed. I believe that Daniel is predictive prophecy, and I believe Isaiah is, so I don't have to go to multiple authorship to try to cover up that. But chapter 36 and 37 kind of form a unit within this, and since we only have 30 minutes, I'm going to deal with 36 and 37, and then do 38 and 39 next time. Now, there are some historical problems in this section. We have to deal with those in the Old Testament. None of us like them, but they're there. And one of them has to do with the relationship of this particular passage about Hezekiah and his refusal to yield to the Assyrian army, and what we have in 2 Kings 18, 14 through 16, where Hezekiah pays tribute to Assyria. It seems to me that the natural flow must be that Hezekiah originally paid tribute when they invaded, but the Lord spoke to him, and he refused to later on in their invasion of Judah. I don't know how else to reconcile these two. There is a beautiful parallel in 2 Kings 18, 13 through chapter 20, verse 19, is a beautiful parallel of this, although part of chapter 38 is left out in that section, but most of it is there. Now, another real problem comes that now it came about in the 14th year of King Hezekiah. The 2 Kings parallel also has 14 years. It's pretty much assured from commentators and archaeologists that the date of this Assyrian invasion under Sennacherib is 701 BC. But when you look at the traditional dates of Hezekiah's reign, now it's true that he co-reigned with his father for a period. And so he began to co-reign in 729, and his father died in 725, and he became king in 725 to 686. But if you take 14 years away from that, you don't get the 701 date. So most people believe, and this is true of conservative scholars, even someone as conservative as E.J. Young, that there has been a scribal error in the word 14, and it should be 24. And if you insert 24, it makes much more sense. We know from 2 Kings 18:1 that 701 is the right date for the Sennacherib Assyrian invasion, and so I think we're going to have to modify 14 to 24. None of us like to do that. If you'd like to see a book on that, I think Gleason's Archer's Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties from a conservative point of view will back up what I'm trying to say to you. Now here we have King Sennacherib, and he was one of the powerful Assyrians. A king of Assyria came up to all the fortified cities of Judah and sieged them. We learn from the Assyrian documents that he says 46 cities fell to him, and that probably is true. And the king of Assyria sent, now I don't know exactly how to pronounce this name. I think it's Rabishah, but I'm not sure. There's been two different ways to interpret this. Some see it as a proper name. Some see it meaning chief steward, or some see it meaning field commander, second or third in charge of the military when they moved with the king. And one of these is true. I think he is a powerful military person. Exactly who and how he's rated the king is somewhat uncertain. Notice they were camped at Lachish. Now they're going to move before this man gets back, but they're at Lachish, and by the way, that shows that they were cutting off any kind of Egyptian help. To Jerusalem, to King Hezekiah with a large army, and he stood by the conduit of the upper pool. This is pretty much the same place that King Ahaz, earlier in Isaiah 7, rejected the Lord's prophet Isaiah saying, "Trust me," but here Hezekiah is going to trust. And notice it says, and here we have three different men that King Hezekiah sent to hear this man's message. The king himself did not come to keep a little decorum and royal dignity, but he sent three men. Now the relationship of these men is somewhat disputed, because they're listed in Isaiah 22:15 for Shebna and Isaiah 22:20 for 24 through Elikim. But it looks like they change roles here, and their offices are just exactly switched. Now, some have said because of chapter 37, verse 2, they may even be priest, but the word Shebna seems to be an Egyptian name and not a Hebrew name at all. From an Egyptian parallel, it seems that these three people kind of lined up like this. That Elikim was the second in command, somewhat like Joseph was in Egypt. This man was the vice regent or vicar of the land of Judah. The second man seems to be the king's correspondent. He wrote the king's material. He kept the king's diary. He wrote the king's letters. And the third man, who we never hear about anywhere else, Asaph, is a recorder, and he'd be the one that was the spokesman for the king, at least in the Egyptian parallel of these three high offices. And maybe that's true. We just can't be certain here. Now, in verse 4 is the beginning of the meat of this chapter, or these two chapters, really. Notice it says, what is this confidence that you have, is my New American Standard. But literally it means, what is this confidence or this trust that you're trusting in? For the next few chapters, this man is going to impugn the God of Israel and Hezekiah and the people's trust in him. Let me show you the flow if I could. Notice in verse 5, on whom you now rely. Look at verse 7. But if you say to me, we trust in the Lord our God. And then look at verse 10. Now I have come up without the Lord's approval. The Lord said to me, go up against this land. Look at verse 15. Nor let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord. Look at verse 18. Beware lest Hezekiah mislead you, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nation delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Look at chapter 37, verse 4. Hear the words of Rabishah, whom the master of the king of Assyria sent, reproaching the living God. Look at verse 6. The servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me, capital me, meaning the Lord spoke this. Look at verse 10. Do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you, saying, look at verse 17, who sent to reproach the living God. Look at verse 20, very important. And now, O Lord our God, deliver us from the hand that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that thou alone art God. Now look at verse 23. Whom you have reproached and blasphemed, against you whom have raised your voice, and haughtily lifted up your eyes against the Holy One of Israel. Verse 24. Your servants have reproached the Lord. Look at verse 29. Because of your raging against me, because of your arrogance has come up to my ears. And on and on. This whole series is based on the fact, much like Daniel chapter 3, where Nebuchadnezzar was reproaching the God of the three Hebrew children, and God defended them. Here we have the same kind of thing. Here is the arrogance of the king of Assyria, assuming no God could withstand his army, assuming his gods are more powerful than the gods of Palestine. And here is this arrogant kind of presentation. That kind of flows in a normal sequence. Watch this. He first says, who are you trusting in? And then, on whom are you trusting that you have rebelled against me? Now the rebel seems to mean that he quit paying tribute. Now, notice this is not so much military as it is religious, this idea of trusting in. Look at verse 6. Behold, you rely on the staff of a crushed reed. Now, it's true that we're going to mention Egypt here, and it's true that Isaiah has criticized Hezekiah for trusting in Egypt. You might want to see chapter 30, verses 1 through 5, or even more succinctly, chapter 31, verses 1 through 3. Egypt was something they tended to rely on, and as always, that was a lack of faith in Yahweh. And Yahweh says Egypt is no help, and that's what exactly the king of Assyria says. Notice, if you would, in verse 7 where it says, but if you say to me, we trust in the Yahweh our Elohim, is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah has taken away? Now we learn about this. Hezekiah did this in 2 Kings 18:7, I believe. But they're making the accusation that this offended Yahweh. These are local shrines where the people had worshipped, but really they worshipped fertility cults in Yahweh's name, and Hezekiah took them away, or eliminated them, to force the people to once more worship at the central shrine. That's what it said in the verse 7. This was God's will from Deuteronomy, where it said, the place that I cause my name to dwell, you shall worship me there. And the sin of the northern tribes was they set up golden calf worship at Dan and Bethel, and they still worship the Lord, but not in the right place. So, the Assyrian military man is trying to say God's mad at Hezekiah for removing his high places, and Yahweh won't help your king. Now that's the the threat, but of course it's not true. In verse 8 is something that is not in the parallel of 2 Kings. It's this haughty expression where this military man says, "Come to the king of Assyria. He'll give you 2,000 horses and just see if you can set a rider on them." Meaning, you don't have 2,000 men. Now, the cavalry was not used this early. This probably means chariot riders, a horse hooked to a chariot, though it doesn't say that. But from history, we don't think that cavalry was used this early. But still, the arrogance is you have a small, weak military. You can't withstand a world power like us. That's the implication. Now, in verse 10, we have this strange thing that this Assyrian military official says, and have I now come up without the Lord's approval? The Lord said to me, go up against the land and destroy it. Now, how did this military man know about this? Some say that somehow the people in Assyria had heard Isaiah's prophecy of chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, where it calls Assyria the rod of my anger. Now, there is a half-truth here. God did call Assyria to judge the northern 10 tribes. You might want to see chapter 37, verse 26. But they did it very cruelly, and they went far beyond what God asked, and God did not give them the southern 2 tribes. And so there's a half-truth, and how this man found out, nobody really knows. In verse 11, we find that these 3 emissaries from Hezekiah said, please, speak to us in Aramaic and not in Judean. Now, Aramaic is the lingua franca of the Persian Empire. It's the diplomatic language, the government language of all the Near East during this point. The Hebrews apparently at this point spoke Hebrew. Later they will speak Aramaic. But right now, the purpose is we don't want what you're saying for all the people in Jerusalem to hear and understand. So speak to us in the diplomatic language. And the emissary from the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, says, he even started shouting louder because that's exactly what he wanted to do, is the people of Jerusalem to hear and rebel against King Hezekiah. So he spoke in Hebrew, and he spoke louder. Notice here in verse 12 is this rather graphic threat by this man that many of you are going to die in this siege. And it's so graphic about having to eat your own excrement and drink your own excrement. It was a horrible thing that when it came to that in sieges, of course, the people died. But that is one of the problems of the siege. And, of course, probably the small towns around Jerusalem, when the Assyrian army came, they all ran into the walled city, and that caused even more problems with sewage and food and all the rest. Now, notice if you would, he keeps on this thing about crying to the people. Look at verse 15. Nor let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord. Oh, my. In verse 17, he kind of talks about, we're not going to hurt you. We're going to give you, we're going to leave you here a little while, and then we're going to take you to a good land and let you live in someone else's house and let you plant someone else's field. And of course, what he's saying is, our policy of exiling you is still in place, and as we took your brothers away to the north, so we're going to take you away. Maybe this is a little more honesty than the man should have had. And notice again in verse 18, beware lest Hezekiah mislead you, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Has any one of the gods of the nations delivered the land from the hand of the king of Syria? This is a powerful argument. All these other gods have fallen. Matter of fact, in chapter 37, it's even going to say that Samaria, the capital of the north, fell. I guess they didn't realize it was the same, quote, supposed to be the same people worshiping Yahweh. I think that means the north had got so far into idolatry. And let's see. You might want to see verse 19 where Samaria is named. And if you want to parallel it, 2 Kings 17, 5 and 6, and the tragedy of the exile in 1724. Let me go into verse 37, chapter 37, if I could. When the king heard this, he tore his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth, signs of mourning. And then the smart man went into the palace, into the temple to talk to God. And his people, these same 3 representatives, were sent to talk to Isaiah to ask him what he thought about this. And then notice here it says, perhaps the Lord your God will hear the words of Rabashah, whom his master, the king of Assyria, sent to reproach the living God. Now here's the problem. Hezekiah had not done everything right. He had paid tribute to Assyria at first. He had looked to Egypt for help some. But when this man started reproaching God and casting aspersions on the God of Israel, friends, he made it a standoff where he is in big trouble. Now, notice it says, the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me, God says. This, of course, was Isaiah responding in God's name. Notice it says what's going to happen to them. Number 7, they're going to hear a rumor Now some think the rumor in verse 7 refers to this Ethiopian prince coming to help in verse 9. Others think there's problems back home. We're not sure that verse 7 is a prophecy related directly to verse 9 or not. And notice that the king of Assyria had moved. He was fighting against Libnah when this man went back to report to him. He had left the city of Lachish, and that's what verse 8 is all about. Now in verse 9 we hear one of the things that happened. Now there is a historical problem here. This man is very famous in both the Egyptian documents, the Assyrian documents, and to some extent in Judea's history. He really does not become the king of Ethiopia or Egypt till many years later. Matter of fact, I think he doesn't become king till 690. This is 701. But he was a prince, and his brother was on the throne of Egypt, and his name is Shebitku. And so it's either anachronism or a way of referring to him early. He's going to have this place later. Notice, if you would, where it says in verse 10, "Do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you." Now in verses 11 through 13, it kind of describes what's going to happen. "Behold, you've heard the king of Assyria you have done to all the lands, destroying them completely. So will you be spared?" Now you might want to see chapter 36, verse 18 through 20, as this is discussed. Let's see. I got to go kind of fast. I'm sorry. There's many of these details in my notes, and I hope you'll read that. It'll make this tape make much more sense to you. Notice in verse 16, "O Lord of hosts, the God of Israel." Notice it says several things in Hezekiah's prayer. Now some have said this sounds very much like Deuteronomy. Well, of course it does. This king read the law. "Who are enthroned above the cherubim." Now that meant that God symbolically dwelt above the Ark of the Covenant, between the wings of the cherubim. There's much symbolism there, much beauty there. The Ark was his footstool, and he lived in heaven, and that's where the people approach God. Notice it says, "Thou art the God, thou alone." And here it sounds like a whole lot like monotheism. This is not henotheism, this is monotheism. And all the kingdoms of the earth. Now this is the universal reign of God. He's control of all history. He called Assyria, he will call Babylon, yet he will punish them too. "Thou hast made heaven and earth." Notice God is creator, the only creator. And now in verse 17 is a series of anthropomorphic phrases which are speaking about God as if he had a human body. God hear, God see, and respond. And because to the words of Sennacherib, who sent to reproach the living God. Now notice in verse 19, it says, "They have cast their gods into the fire, for they were not gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. They have destroyed them." Now this, of course, speaks of the idolatry of the nations, and I think, and of Israel to some extent, the northern 10 tribes also. Now verse 20 is very important to me. I think we must remember that God has worked through Israel to try to bring all the world to himself, going back even to Genesis chapter 12, Exodus 19, 5 and 6. So God is going to whistle for these pagan nations to judge his people because his people sinned. But now he's going to defeat these pagan nations so the world will know that he's God. So the world is meant to see the power of Yahweh through his blessing and his judgment. Look at verse 20. Very important. "And now, O Yahweh our Elohim, deliver us from the hand, that all the kings of the earth may know that thou alone, Yahweh, art Elohim." And that's beautiful. And I think we see here what is the purpose of God's acts, to bring all the world to him. In Isaiah, we found in chapter 19, verses 23 through 25, that Assyria is invited for salvation, that Egypt is invited for salvation, and so God is trying to reach all the world. Now, notice verse 21. "Because you have prayed to me." God apparently was going to act based on Hezekiah's prayer. Now, I must say that I think this shows the significance of prayer. The New Testament says, "We have not because we've asked not." I believe that God, in his sovereignty, has limited himself to respond to the prayers of his children. Therefore, our prayers, though God already knows the situation, that God already has a will and a plan, he's willing to modify what he has chosen to do, or willing to change what he is doing based on his children's prayer. Otherwise, why do we believe in intercessory prayer? This is a significant thing about prayer here, and I hope you'll look at it again. Now, I think verse 22, this virgin daughter of Zion, she has shaken her head behind you. I think just the idea of shaking your head was a sign of derision, like, boy, just forget that. And here is a virgin that this bully is trying to make sexual advances. It seems to even imply that God is the true boyfriend or suitor of Israel. And so it's a marriage metaphor, and the marriage is rejected. Notice in verse 24 and 25, this is the boast of the Assyrian king. And this Assyrian king is saying something like this: where there were problems for my army, I solved them. Where there was no water, I dug wells. Where there was no bridge, I crossed rivers. I have done all these things, and who is going to deliver you out of my hand? Verse 24 and 25. It seems to be the king of Assyria bragging. In verse 26 through 29, God responds to this arrogance. Have you not heard? Long ago I did it. From ancient times I planned it, and now I have brought it to pass. Now, folks, this is where God's saying, I'm in control here. I'm the one that's always been in control. It's my will. It reminds me of a few lessons ago. Let me see if I can find it real quick back here, and where God says, I planned to do this, and I performed it, and I'm the one that did it. And I think that is so true. Well, in this moment I can't find it, but I'll have it in your notes for you because I'll find it then. God's in control. God's in control of Assyria. He's in control of Israel. He's in control of Judah. I have brought it to pass. Now, friend, God knows what He's doing. This world is not cyclical. It's teleological. It's moving toward a climax. God is going to bring time to an end. He knows what's going to happen. Things don't surprise Him. And that's what He's saying to this arrogant Assyrian monarch. In verse 28, I just love this where it says, but I know you're sitting down, I know you're going out, I know you're coming in. Now, folks, that sounds a whole lot like Psalms 139. Now, when it says, I know you're raging against me, here we see it in a negative context. So God knows the king of Assyria, but in Psalm 139, it's God knows His children. God knows our hearts, and yet He still responds. Look at verse 29. Here again, God just confronts this arrogance of this Assyrian king. Because of your raging against me, and because of your arrogance has come to my ears, therefore I'm going to put a hook in your nose. Now, we know from history that Assyria deported the people she conquered to keep them under control. They killed the young, they killed the old, they killed the leaders, and they marched the people into someone else's home by putting hooks in their nose and tying ropes to them. And God says, I'm going to do to you what you've done to others. Oh my, and He certainly did. And so, let's see. Now in verse 30 we have this, I shall give a sign to you. Now there's another sign in chapter 38 verse 7. Here's a 3-year sign. Apparently this invasion by Sennacherib involved several years, and God says, I'm going to give you 3 years till you get back to normal. It's a promise that things will be back to normal. This army will be gone and you'll be in the land. Verse 33 says, there'll be no siege here. There'll be no siege mound. Now siege mound is where they put dirt up against the walls so they could bring their battering rams up against the walls. God says none of that will happen. This battle's not going to reach the city of Jerusalem. I think that's very interesting. And why is He going to do it? Well, look at verse 35. For my own sake, you might want to see verse 20 again, and for the sake of David, my servant David. Now, I'll remind you of 2 Samuel chapter 7, where God promised David that always be a man on the throne, and Hezekiah is his descendant. And God says, I remember that promise, and I'm going to keep it. This is not going to happen to you. I'm in charge here, and I'm going to fulfill my Davidic promise to your father David, and I'm going to do it so all the world will know me. Verse 20. Now, in verse 36 is where the death angel comes. It's called the angel of the Lord here. It's very similar to the death angel of the last plague of the Exodus. Went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. Now, it doesn't seem like that they are before the walls of Jerusalem here. It seems like they're still at Libnah, maybe. But wherever the camp was, that's where this plague hit. 185,000. You say, that's too many. Well, that was a large part of his army, I grant you that. He himself didn't die. And when the men arose early in the morning, there were some left. Behold, all of them were dead bodies. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. Now, Nineveh is the capital of Assyria on the Tigris River. And now, there is about a 20-year gap between verse 37 and verse 38. You can't tell it from the text, but we can from history. It's about 701 this invasion occurred, and we know that this exact prophecy happened to him in 681 B.C. Now, what happened? Well, he was in the house of his god. Now, this god Nisroch, we have no idea who this is. There's no other reference to this except in the 2 King parallel. From the Septuagint, there is kind of a form of a word that seems close to the chief god of Assyria, Ashur, A-S-S-H-U-R. And so most believe that this is just a corruption or a misprint or a nickname for Ashur, the chief god of the Assyrians. And he was 20 years later, worshiping there. 2 of his sons came in and killed him, and another son took his place as king. And this is Esarhaddon, that's mentioned in verse 38, and he reigned from 681 to 669. And so here we see, now I realize I'm in the midst of a historical setting, and I can't cover the whole thing in one lesson, so I'll cover the next 2 chapters next. But this does show us the transition, that the power of the Assyrians is broken, and in 38 and 39 are going to show us the rising power of the Babylonians. Really, it's the Neo-Babylon. It's a new Babylon. But I think that's really important. It's interesting as a historical note to know the Greek historian Herodotus mentions the death of all these soldiers. He said it was caused by rats that ate their shields and their weapons, and apparently he's referring to bubonic plague that comes from the fleas on rats or rodents. But this happened overnight, and the bubonic plague is not that fast. So I think it's the supernatural power of God. Now, if he used natural means, I don't know. And where Herodotus got his information, no one knows, unless it's some kind of Egyptian tradition. But again, it's interesting that this whole account is corroborated to some extent in historical documents like Herodotus' writings. Well, I've really enjoyed being with you. I'm sorry I've had to go so fast. And we'll cover the rest of this historical section next time when we do 38 and 39. God bless you. Have a good day.